Hi. So in class, we've just finished talking about World War One. The major things I want you to be able to take away from World War One, and I know we talked about it for a few days, so to combine it in, a few seconds is a lot, but it's trench warfare, the terrible conditions that went along with it, all of the new weapons like machine guns and tanks and poison gas that were killed to use people, that it was a total war, that women on the home front had to take jobs in factories, that people had to ration things, and that the Treaty of Versailles is what ends the war and it punishes Germany. It does a lot of things to Germany, but three of the main things is it forces Germany to accept the war guilt clause, meaning they have to accept responsibility for starting the war, even though it started between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. They have to pay war reparations in the millions and millions of dollars, and they have to give up territory, their colonies all over the world. So it's really, really going to hurt German pride, economy, and they're also not allowed to have a military. They have to shrink their army down to like 100,000 men. So Germany is going to want its revenge for how harshly it was treated in the Treaty of Versailles. Just like the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This is a major treaty, but this is going to lead right to World War II. So it's important to be familiar with that. So we stopped talking about World War One, and yesterday you started working on causes of the Russian Revolution. So let's put the Russian Revolution in context. We know they freed the serfs in 1861. It's an Eastern European country, so it remained under serfdom for a long time, based on agriculture, not very industrialized. Russia is going to join the war on the Allied powers on the sides of Great Britain and France to fight against Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. But Germany is much more industrialized, so Germany is going to beat the Russians bad in World War One, and it's going to cause a lot of problems within Russia that lead to revolution or an overthrow of the government. The same way we talked about the French government being overthrown in 1789, a very similar thing is going to happen in Russia in 1917. So let's talk about some of the problems in Russia. They have an absolutist government with Tsar Nicholas II in charge. Tsar is also sometimes spelled with a TS and to start instead of CZ, just in case you see that. It's basically an absolute monarch. Complete power over he has complete power over everything that goes on in the country. Russia didn't experience, the Enlightenment era reforms as much as Western European countries did. In 1905, they get embarrassed by a war with Japan. So Japan is starting to industrialize. We talked about the Meiji Restoration, where they started to industrialize and westernize. Russia loses a humiliating defeat to Japan. It's the first time that a major European country loses to an Asian country in warfare. People protest in 1905 outside the Tsar's Winter Palace and are met with bullets by the guards in 1905 called Bloody Sunday. And terrible working conditions in factories. There's a lack of food, and then World War One is going to be the thing that actually starts it because of all the deaths and things that are occurring. So in 1917, with a failing war effort, poor economic conditions, and lack of food, workers and peasants and the military began to mutiny and strike, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to advocate, or basically to give up his throne. He's from the Romanov family, and there's a Disney movie on this, Anastasia, if you've ever seen it. However, the Disney movie is clearly not accurate, and we'll talk about that later as we go. But if you can just keep in mind, revolutions happen when the government is not meeting the needs of the people. Poor economic conditions, lack of food, poor working conditions. You can pretty much talk about this for any revolution and have it be correct. So the Tsarist government was overthrown by two groups: the Provisional Government, which takes over after he gives up power, and the Petrograd Soviet, who are a group of communist socialists who support the lower class and peasants and the working class. While the provisional government takes over, they expand suffrage, they expand civil rights, but they make two huge mistakes. So the provisional government is, again, the ones that take over after Tsar Nicholas II advocates. They stayed in World War One, and they gave no land to the peasants. There was very few food still being created. So when economic conditions didn't improve and the military kept losing during World War One, the Petrograd Soviet began to stir the poor to rebel against the provisional government, which was the Duma, the parliament that's created. To make matters worse, the Germans had sent a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, who was exiled by Russia years earlier. to further destabilize the government because he was a very outspoken communist that was exiled for speaking against the Tsar years earlier. But he goes back and he takes over leadership of the Petrograd Soviets who want to make even more changes in Russia. So this leads us to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Bolshevik, in our terms that we're talking about, it means communist. So the Bolshevik Party are communist. For several months, the Petrograd Soviet and Vladimir Lenin, who was a very good public speaker, worked together to solidify the support of the lower class and peasants, including the working class. Lenin's political party, as we said, the Bolsheviks, adopted this saying, and this saying is important to know: peace, land, and bread. And I know those are pretty basic, things that people would want, but peace meant specifically pull them out of World War I. Land meant, dividing land up and giving more land to peasants, and bread, food, in an attempt to win complete support of the peasants who desperately needed peace, land, and bread. Additionally, in the Russian capital city of Petrograd, the Petrograd Soviet would work extensively to win worker and military support against the provisional government. So basically, they were happy Tsar Nicholas II was gone. However, they were unhappy with the provisional government and how they took over. They didn't make enough changes to keep the Bolshevik Party happy. So by October 17, the military campaigns eventually led to an army mutiny. The army just basically stopped fighting, and they returned to major cities in Russia to start rioting against the provisional government. So the Petrograd Soviet unified under the leadership of Lenin and the Bolsheviks and immediately took power and basically said, no more democratic process, I'm in charge now. And this is going to start a civil war between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviets, who are trying to turn Russia into a full communist state. So the first order for business for Lenin and the Bolsheviks was the first steps of Marxism: complete state control of all work and industry. Secondly, they allowed workers to take and distribute all private property, which then the state would run. So remember, communist government in control. They pretty much own everything, decide what is created and how much it's used for. However, they do give equal gender rights. They do pull Russia out of World War I, and this is when Russia's name changes to the Soviet Union. So even though we might disagree with the concept of communism, they still do pass some political equality things and pull Russia out of the World War I with Germany. So despite these changes, economic and food problems would continue even under state control because peasants held on to extra food because, if you're used to starving and, the government is coming around to collect your food, you're probably going to hide some more for yourself in case something bad happens. So additionally, the Mensheviks, which were basically anybody who wasn't a communist, people that wanted capitalism, people that still supported the Tsar, more moderate people are going to be like, no, this is too extreme. We need to stop the Bolsheviks, and are going to attempt to remove them from power, which leads to a civil war in Russia. So in 1919, the Mensheviks deemed the White Army, and we said made up of all those groups that weren't, complete socialists, began to fight the Bolsheviks army, the Red Control, think Red Communism for control. While there had initially been no bad blood between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, the Western powers, which basically the United States, England, France, those countries, all worried about a country that was going to adopt communism. So they're going to send money and military supplies to help the Mensheviks and the White Army try to defeat the communist Bolsheviks so they can take over Russia. But additionally, lack of incentive to produce led peasants to reduce agricultural, money started being worthless like it was in Germany. Then this fight's going to go on for a long time. Basically, at the end, Lenin and the Red Army are going to win. However, it's going to now be very awkward because, the leader of a major country, Russia, Lenin, knows that basically they were supported by Russia and the United States as it was going through.